Welcome on, welcome all to the Politics of Cinema. We are not your typical film review podcast. On this show, we believe films are cultural artifacts. There's a political as well as artistic message captured in every film, either on purpose or on accident, and we're on the lookout for all of it. My name is Aaron Spears.
And my name is Isaac Miller. And today we are going to be talking about Sergei Eisenstein's masterpiece, Battleship Potemkin. Political masterpiece. Some would say propaganda masterpiece. But, you know, propaganda in the name of revolution is, in my opinion, a good thing.
Propaganda doesn't always equal bad.
No.
Yeah.
And we were doing this, I believe this is our first request episode.
Mm-hmm. Request outside of us two.
Yes. I mean, we've had a lot of requests, but our first request episode, because my grandma wanted us to cover this. She's 94. COVID has been pretty rough this year, and she wanted me to cover this movie, so we're going to cover this movie. Also, because it couldn't be more on theme for this podcast.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't in like our top 5 when we were like creating the podcast and the idea for it, but as soon as you mentioned that she requested, I was like, that's perfect.
So, what is this?
What is this indeed? What do we start with first? We start with a little Russian history context, or do we do some film history context first? Or take turns?
Let's take turns. I mean, I think, the first thing is that this is a movie about the mutiny aboard the Russian battleship Potemkin, which was based, I think, it's not clear to me, I think it may have come back from the front. Or the front? Is there a front when they're fighting at sea? During the
that's a good question.
Yeah, well, during the Russian war with Japan in 1905, but was based in the Black Sea and was harbored near Odessa, which is now, I believe, part of Ukraine, or was part of Ukraine then too, but that was part of the Russian Empire. So, to sort of set the stage here, this is set during the Revolution of 1905. The Revolution of 1905, prior to the more famous Revolution of 1917, is set off by the Russian defeat by the Japanese. They're competing for dominance in like Manchuria, China more broadly, and it's a historic event because the 19th century is the period in which Europe sort of conquers the world, or mainly France and Britain, but other European states as well. And Russia is part of this, but in a different way. I mean, Russia is both an old school, what you call sort of polyglot empire, in that you have sort of hierarchies based on religion or ethnicity, but like it's not a colonial empire of the new type. Through a lot of it in places like Ukraine. So it's closer to like the Ottoman Empire, let's say, in that sense. But then also it spends a lot of the 19th century conquering Central Asia, adding, and this had started before the 19th century, and adding, 20 million Muslims to its overall population. There have been prior to that. If you ever go to Jordan and you wonder why there are people of, let's say, Chechen or Circassian descent, these are ethnic groups that come out of the Caucasus, because their ancestors were ethnically cleansed by the Russians in the 19th century into the Ottoman Empire. Or what was then the Ottoman Empire. And then the Ottoman government settled them in what's now Jordan, in Transjordan. So Russia is an expansionist power. It's also one of the formerly most reactionary in Europe at this point. This is an era of the very minimum constitutional monarchy, democracy, quote unquote, is on the march. That doesn't mean you don't have monarchies in most of Europe, and it doesn't mean that you have full enfranchisement, but not even having a constitution or anything is considered quite backwards, and Russia is like that. It is an absolute autarky at this point under the czars.
That's building up to during 1905,
or that's when 1905 occurs. So when the Russian forces are defeated, showing their ineptitude of their commanders and the ill-equippedness of their forces, there's already been rumblings of it. The truth is we can't actually describe this revolution here very effectively without a major detail blow by blow, because this is an immense empire in land sense, and all
right.
over there's different things. But what is common is there's huge waves of strikes. There's peasant rebellions in the countryside. There's riots and looting in a good way, and there's various political forces, various leftist parties the Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks, the SRs, all the players that you'll see during the revolution of 1917, as well as various liberal forces, all contributing to the ferment of this. You have general strikes in like St. Petersburg, open rebellion, which, and you also have the first appearance of Soviets. Right, Soviets are invented in this. The Soviet Union is named after, but these are workers' councils meant to sort of govern, in a collective way, in a revolutionary way. And this is the first time you see them during this revolution.
Huh.
It's it's incredibly intense. The reaction. I mean, the revolution is sort of started off by a major strike in Moscow, in which the soldiers murder, I think, 700 people. So
Jesus.
yeah, I mean, what to be clear, so the most famous thing in this movie, the thing that you've probably seen if you've never watched it, is the Odessa steps
Odessa
scene,
steps.
right, where
Yeah.
the soldiers are marching down the steps, shooting revolutionary citizenry who are desperately trying to escape. You
The
see
baby carriage bouncing down.
the baby
Yeah.
carriage bounds down, the whole thing. That never happened. But that's only because that's a more dramatic way to get across that there had been looting in the city. Once again, not a bad thing during a revolution. You should be looting the rich. But basically, there had been a revolution upsurge in the city, and 1,000 people were murdered by Tsarist forces to bring it under control.
Right.
It just wasn't all in one place like that.
Right. Dramatic license.
Yeah. So this is a major shaking thing, and the regime is not able to react to it particularly well, but it's also fairly disjointed. So they're able to sort of deal with it in different parts. There's massive peasant uprisings, but those are disjointed with the workers' uprisings. Like it doesn't, they basically give formal civil rights as a concession, like that you literally didn't have that before. And they create the Duma, which is like the government does this as concession to the revolution. Basically, a rubber stamp parliament, which doesn't even, I don't think it ever actually sits. Like it might have gotten elected and then never does anything. But basically, the revolution sort of loses its momentum and ebb, and the Russian military doesn't crack a lot. The soldiery is relatively. I mean, some parts of it are unreliable, but not completely. But it's basically they're able to hold the line with small units and huge amounts of violence. But the Navy is especially volatile, as I understand it. Most of them are literate, so revolutionary ideas are able to spread more freely. And so, of course, the Battleship of Potemkin is based off of a real instance. There is a Battleship Potemkin. It doesn't happen exactly as the movie portrays it. There's another ship that tries to rebel, but there's a counter rebellion aboard the ship, and it doesn't actually work out. And in a lot of ways, what's seen as sort of a triumph at the end of the movie of them sort of escaping through the fleet because the soldiers, or because the sailors aboard the other ships won't fire on them, actually is sort of them just running for it.
Spoilers.
Yeah, well, yes, spoilers for a nearly 100-year-old movie based off an actual real
100-year-old movie.
based off an actual real historical incident.
Right.
One other point about the Revolution of 1905 for context. So, for instance, if you've ever read like The Mass Strike by Rosa Luxemburg, who's one of the great Marxist intellectuals of the early 20th century, The Mass Strike is looking at this revolution and basically arguing for understanding it as part of Marxist revolutionary theory. But the other thing about it from my personal history is 1905 is when my family, who were Russian Jews from the Russian Empire, from what they call the Pale of Settlement, where Jews were allowed to settle, this is when they left. Because the family story is, I believe my great grandmother got arrested, and my great great grandfather was like, "All right, it's time to go. Let's get out of here before more of my kids get arrested."
Smart move. Yeah.
So I actually exist because of the revolution of 1905. So I guess I should have a little more affection for it.
It feels like you do.
Yeah, I mean, well, but I have to admit, like, I've never really vibed on the Revolution of 1905 as much as I should now that I think about it. It's like, oh yeah, no, this is kind of significant in your personal history.
Yeah.
So that's the context, but there's a second context to this movie, right? Because there's the context of when it's made.
Right.
It's made in the mid-20s, which is
Mhm.
after the Russian Civil War, after the Bolsheviks have thoroughly taken control. By this point, I believe Lenin has died. But the power struggles in the later 20s that lead to Stalin taking over haven't happened yet, or are ongoing, basically, at this point. And this is a relatively open period within the Soviet Union. both the NEP is basically a set of market reforms where they sort of relaxed like the command economy that they had during the Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1921, I believe, which had been incredibly devastating and brutal. There's lots of economic reasons for this. It's not worth getting into, but it's also a period of incredible artistic flourishing in which, Soviet artists are sort of at the forefront of the world with sort of some acquiescence from the government. Like innovations aren't like Sergei Eisenstein, who's like one of the most important filmmakers of all time. Like, like it seems like the government is like fine. I mean, this is like certainly politically they're on board with it, but they're not really into sort of the innovative styles, partially because these aren't actually particularly popular. Like 85% of what people are watching in the Soviet Union in the 20s is like Douglas Fairbanks
It's
and Mary
Hollywood. Yeah.
Pickford and like American. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
Hollywood stuff, right? Because you've just been through a revolution and then World War One, a revolution, and then an absurdly brutal civil war, and
Yeah.
then immediately after that, famines in large parts of the country. Millions of people have died.
It puts a dent in your film output.
Yeah, well, it's not that actually. They have an explosion of film output. What it does is it puts a dent in people. Like people want entertain. It's. I think the point with that viewership is just that people are not quite up for like super heady stuff.
Well, there's that, but there was like scarcity of resources at some point too. Because one of the guys we're going to talk about in the film world of it, like he couldn't get his hands on stock, like he couldn't get his hands on film stock to film.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. But so basically, that's sort of the political context. Is the NEP is this very specific period in Russian history or in Soviet
Right.
history where things have sort of opened up it a lot, and so it means that you get a lot of interesting stuff. I just want to make one more parallel, but think of it
Yeah.
this way: you think of all this devastation, everything. Think about post-war Japan. Think about post dictatorship South Korea and the Korean New
Mhm.
Wave that we've had going really for 30 years. Um,
Yeah.
these innovation in a horrible way, innovation seems to come out of moments like this. So I don't think it's an
Yes.
accident you're having this right now after a revolution, after all that energy, pent
Yeah.
up energy is allowed to flow out.
Well, you have that. I mean, we've mentioned it too over the course of the podcast when we did our 60s series. Again, self plug there, like we do every episode. We talked about the French New Wave and the Japanese New Wave in two different episodes. Like the French New Wave, we were talking specifically about that idea of, the being occupied by the Germans. Like there was a halt to the film industry within France, and then there's this flourishing afterwards. It allows you to almost have, well, that's sort of out of context for what we're talking about with Russian film right now, but it allows you to have an easy break with the past. If there is a history to the art form in your country at that time, you can kind of do a break with that, and that's when you get like the Nouvelle Vogue or the Hollywood New Cinema or New Polish Cinema. Like there's all these times when there's great devastation like that creates an artistic break with the past and like an embracement of everything new and novel and interesting. Horrible preface to what was going on in Russian cinema at the time, because cinema was just born. Like it's a brand new medium, it's a brand new thing. And one of the things I find really interesting in what was going on in Russian film, you get the whole idea of montage theory and the different schools of thought within there. But this is a time when film language is being invented in real time, like the way that we think about the rhythms of editing, or the how when you cut from one thing to another thing it means something, or a fade to black means end of scene. Like the film language is being invented at this time in real time in a way that's about to be rewritten, because sound is about to hit the stage, so to speak, hit the screen, so to speak, because this is not the era of sound film just yet. We're still operating only in silent film territory at this point in time. So the Russian school of thought on montage is really interesting, and Eisenstein is at the forefront of that, mainly because it this is really stretching my film brain back to film school a little bit. These aren't disparate people who aren't a lot of them are working together or colleagues. I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but the Moscow Film School, it's not actually what it was called, is one of the very first film schools in the world that's established. And I think that speaks to what you're saying with like a post revolutionary kind of mindset of, like, okay, well, we need the arts, and that's established here. Eisenstein actually though comes out of the theater world, and I didn't know this ahead of time, so I was reading up a little biographical stuff on Eisenstein, and he was staging plays in wild locations, like out in the world, like out in factories, and out in communities. And there was like some audiences were just like, I'm not sitting on a can to watch this play, like it was pretty wild stuff. I was like, oh my god, this guy's really pushing the boundaries. And it seemed like film was a natural draw for him, because he was realizing the limitations of the stories he could tell and how he could express himself on the stage, and he jumps into film, specifically the tools of editing, because he's seen the power to generate meaning and elicit emotion, because you're not tied down to time and location specifically in film the way that you are in theater, which I think is really, really kind of fascinating. This is all on display in Potemkin, and I have a few examples of his main montage theories that we can talk about as we talk through the movie itself. But one of the ones, one of his contemporaries I wanted to point out, who was teaching at the Moscow Film School, or was teaching at this film school, he actually had his own kind of separate unit, Kuleshov, Kuleshov. I am terrible with pronunciations. I'm just going to say that up front because we're going to have a bunch of bad Aaron pronunciations in this episode.
You better get your Russian right.
I'm just going to throw it to you when it's time for the.
I didn't say I could pronounce Russian names, but fair enough.
Well, he has this famous thing that I remember watching specifically in film school called the Kuleshov effect, and it's this really interesting. It's an editing. It's like 45 seconds. Of course, you can find it on YouTube nowadays, so you can find it on YouTube really easily. It's a guy. It's a shot of a guy straight looking at the camera, poker face on, just total poker face. He's not expressing any real emotion. And then they cut to I think it's like a child in a coffin, fake. I mean, it's staged for the movie. They didn't go get an actual dead kid. Cuts back to the man, same exact face. Cuts to a bowl of soup. Cuts back to the man, same exact face. Cuts to, I think it's like a woman, like kind of like laying, clothed or whatever on like a chase lounge sort of thing. Cuts back to the man, same face. But as you watch it though, the audience, you generate meaning in the man's face, because like, oh, he's looking very hungrily at that soup. Oh, he's looking very mournfully at the innocent loss of life at this, kid in a casket. Like, oh, he's looking very lustfully at this woman laying on this chase lounge here. So it's this early idea of juxtaposing different images. Like if you show this image first, not juxtaposing, but like kind of putting them next to each other. This image plus this image equals this new meaning that you get, that you don't get if you just show a bowl of soup or you just show a guy. So that was sort of the film language that Kuleshov was working through, but also Eisenstein was around. So he went a step further though, and this is where you get the actual, oh shoot, it's one of your favorite words, Isaac. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank. The dialectic approach.
Not an accident. Not an accident when you right after you've had a bunch of Marxists take over. Suddenly it's like, maybe we should be dialectical.
This is where you get like Marx's film theory, which I'm not prepared to speak at length about at this point, but I remember reading through that in film school as well. It comes out of the historical events that they're all around, and they're applying it to their art now.
Right.
His idea is film montage is meaning is created when ideas arise from the collision of two separate independent shots, and now you get a new meaning coming out of that by putting those two things together. It's a really interesting way to go about it, but it's a breakthrough in film editing and film language worldwide, and just for the world of cinema in general, because it's not continuity editing. I know Khrushchev and Potemkin and Eisenstein, Ziga Vertov, I think as well. The Intolerance, the D.W. Griffith movie, was huge. It was a huge influence and a huge hit in Russia. And the example of editing that you've got with D.W. Griffith was mostly continuity editing. This shot happens, then the action of this leads to the next thing, leads to the next thing, leads to the next thing. So the continuity is maintained, and the story continues. Like the next shot makes sense because it builds more of the story. Which isn't to say that Potemkin doesn't work that way. It does, but it works in a different way as well. So it's a different approach to editing that I think is really interesting that came about. Ziga Vertov, if you've ever seen like Man with the Movie Camera, is my favorite of his, and I watched that endlessly in film school. He's going a bit more abstract, and that's a whole Kino Pravda Sinai thing. It's pretty interesting. Vertov is actually my one buddy would always joke that like he was an early transhumanist, because he actually thought that he would say man, but humankind is going to evolve. What was this quote here? I have it in the notes. From a bumbling citizen through the poetry of the machine to the perfect electric man. Like it's this weird, like we can perfect our perfection or our perception of the world and become better via the Sinai or the Kino Pravda kind of cinema that Vertov was working on. But Eisenstein is interesting because he's doing this whole collision thing where like you could put different opposing or different contradictory things next to each other and create this new meaning, which he does all throughout Potemkin. The five main ones that we're going to mention as we go through the movie are metric, rhythmic, tonal, overtonal, and intellectual. That we'll describe as we go through here, talking about the movie. I think it really hit me as fascinating and has really stuck with me all these years, because at this point, film school was, the late 90s, early 2000s for me. It's this idea, like the actual work of art then that you're producing only works if your audience is paying attention and it comes through in the mind's eye and in the brain of the viewer. Like it's all on the screen, but it's almost like you're given the equation on the screen, and then the solution to that equation is what happens in your head as you're watching it.
Hmm.
It's kind of a different way. Like it only fully exists once it's being like appreciated and watched. I guess that could be said of all film, but it's kind of different because it's like it's making you do some of the work
Huh.
as you
I
watch it.
mean, once again, it's something you could sort of say of all film, but in a different way.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, like it's not disconnected from continuity editing. It's just it's like I think it's like I've always thought of it as the next step in continuity editing. Like continuity editing is fine, so like the viewer isn't lost. Again, this is as film language is being developed in the silent era. So the viewer isn't lost in the narrative. Or like, wait, what's going on? Why they show me this now? The continuity takes you. There's a continuity through line to the narrative, to the film, to the visuals. But Eisenstein's taken it a step further and creating even more meaning by putting different visuals together and also in different rhythms and tones, which we'll get into. But
Hmm.
I think it tickles me intellectually and as a film geek because it's really similar to when we did First Reformed, the Paul Schrader film with Ethan Hawke. God, probably like 8-9 months ago now at this point. Because on that episode we were talking about Paul Schrader was like he had a fully formed film theory and this idea about how to make a film and how to like the transcendence on film. They even wrote a whole book about it. And Eisenstein's in that same book, actually. So sorry, Paul Schrader's in that same group that Eisenstein, because Eisenstein was decades and decades before and ahead of his time. Eisenstein's a full film theorist who was like publishing essays and books on like his theories on montage and how to put a film together and how to elicit emotion from audiences and how to build a narrative. So it's another one of those like true film geek and also theoretician who's also an amazing film artist, which are my favorite filmmakers. So
I mean, part of it, and he's doing this right when film is. I mean, right, film isn't really an art form yet, or it's debated over whether it is, or it's it's.
well, that's interesting too, because in Russia at the time, it's considered an art form. They're establishing schools to study it. In America, starting in 1915, it's officially legally not an art form; it's commerce. So
Right.
it just tells you how the different industries, different I guess different nations, look at it differently. But yeah, like no, it's like it's a new art form, and you're watching the language be developed, and in a fucking phenomenally successful way in Potemkin.
I mean, it is. I mean, part of it is I didn't understand all that in a lot of ways, but what just strikes you when you watch it is the sheer power of it today, which doesn't always come through with your silent movies, right? Like,
Mm-mm.
it doesn't always. Sometimes you have to make an adjustment for older movies and how you think about film language, how you're reacting to it. This I think, when you watch the staircase scene, when you feel the tension on the deck when the sailors are, whether they're going to rebel or not, the sailors have all been lined up after refusing to eat rotten meat. And
Right.
and they bring out the Marines to shoot some of them, for daring to not eat rotten meat. And it's
Yeah.
the tension is palpable, and it is the film language that allows it to do that and makes a modern audience still feel that. Like they don't have to be told that.
Right. Right. Right.
So the movie is broken into 5 acts. The movie is broken into 5 acts. So let's just go through those real quick so everybody is sort of oriented better.
Well, you were kind of describing Act One already. The men in maggots. It's sailors on guess what, the Battleship Potemkin, kind of waking up for the day, and they're seeing like this disgusting, God, close-ups of maggots on dead animals. It's even gross in black and white.
Hmm.
There's no way around it. And then the doctor's like poking it with his glasses. It's just so gross. Sorry, vegetarian talking here, but the yeah, it's showing you the conditions, but it also, like you said, you mentioned specifically the Navy being literate. The one of the main sailors, he's even reading off, comrades, the time has come, we must speak out. Why wait? All of Russia has risen. What are we to be the last? He's kind of down in I guess it's the hammock section of the boat because they're all sleeping in these hanging hammocks, kind of rallying the troops. So like you see like he's reading off of a sheet of paper, and he's fomenting rebellion, and it's really effective. And then you have this meat sequence where the crew is clearly repulsed by this. There's a doctor on board, the ship's doctor, and he inspects him. He's like, hey, just wash it off with some brine, you'll be good, it's fine for cooking. It's like literally the last straw. But like I knew very little of that political context that you gave at the top of the show, Isaac. So I've only been watching this as like, oh, it's a rebellion within the ranks of the military. They're joining the people on shore eventually. There's the Odessa Steps massacre. What the fuck is going on? They fire on the opera house. They sail off, and it's all good. It seems like it may work out, even though there's a lot of dead people on the steps, because now like other people in the Navy have joined them. Your context is really interesting to help me kind of get a fuller appreciation of what's really going on here. So it's because it really hadn't really registered how much was going on amongst the population. Not I've really been focused on the military, which is what the bulk of the story is here.
Well, and that's just, and part of it is there aren't, though the military is restive, there aren't extensive desertions from the military during the revolution. So, I mean, what Velokinchuk, all right, I can't say it, I admit it. But what he's, I mean, yeah, I mean, when they're down below, and this is basically their sleeping quarters, so everybody's in hammocks, and it's when they're sort of going down for the night, and he's trying to get them to join in, and it's a little hard to tell, but I feel like part of it is that he's not actually getting, it takes the rotten meat and then everybody being brought on board, and even then there's a part of the, so this is the first part is Men and Maggots, and that deals with him trying to get them to trying to raise them up to join the revolution, and then basically the sailors
Right.
telling the officers, we can't eat we can't eat this, we're not going to, and when borscht is made from it they won't do it. And so the second act is the sailors being, the whole crew being brought up onto the deck, basically to be disciplined into eating rotten food.
Right.
It's not a it's not an accident that there's a Orthodox priest on hand for this, of course, because it's part of the ideological apparatus of the Tsarist regime. There's
My
no
vote
separate.
for creepiest character in this movie.
Yeah, no, they make him creepy.
He's got the eraser head hair going. It's blowing in the wind. He's beating that crucifix into his palm.
Punish those who would dare to go against the hierarchies of society. I mean, you can
Yeah.
really feel part of what gets across so well. I mean, I think just is the division between the officers and the sailors, and the sort of aristocratic airs of the officers. That how
Yeah.
dare you? There is not an inch given to. They're just lied to, but there's not an
Mhm.
inch given to. Maybe we shouldn't, maybe they have good cause to not want to eat this. And I
Right.
think underlying that is both the standard discipline of the military, but also that this is this is an aristocratic society, right? And so how
Mhm.
dare these commoners dare to speak back in a way when the hierarchy of the system,
Right. We've spoken. End of story.
right?
Well, this leads to the mutiny.
Right, and that's still in Act Two, which
Right.
is an incredible action sequence.
It really is. It really is. It's this Act Two is called Drama on the Deck. It's a big mass action sequence, which I find these really fascinating to watch. I've been watching like this, and I've been watching a lot of 30s like pre-code stuff for a class I'm teaching right now. And action sequences, they look so unchoreographed in this time period. It looks like legit chaos, and there's a energy to it that you're just seeing like 80 guys just brawling all at once.
Hmm.
It's pretty interesting. But however, in the mutiny, it is successful, but Vakulnichuk is killed in the process. He sort of he falls overboard. He's kind of stuck in a few bits of ropes. His crewmen, his comrades, they come and they get him out of the water, but it's too late. He's died, and he ends up being displayed publicly once they take him ashore. And there's a note on him that says for a spoonful of borscht, which as you referenced, that's what they were turning the rotten meat into. So this sequence I wanted to mention real quick because this is an example of one of Eisenstein's montage theories. This is the tonal one. So we're talking about this action sequence. So a tonal montage, it uses the emotional meaning of the shots, not just manipulating like the links or rhythms of the cut with rhythmic characteristics, which we'll get into in a different example to elicit a reaction from the audience. It's more complex than that because it's trying to go for this broader emotional idea, which you only get if you have some build up and you have some characterization and you're building an arc to take these characters through the story. So this scene, you've got like the death of the revolutionary sailor. He ends up being on a smaller ship that heads into Odessa. You get like the fog starts to roll in. It's a darker scene. He's laid to rest in a tent. You get a POV shot of him like in this small tent in the harbor on the land, almost from his point of view, looking out at the harbor, and you just see a ship just sort of slowly float by, left to right. And then Act Three starts with the fog itself, and it grows increasingly brighter as the sun comes up and the fog starts to dissipate. But the tonal shift is should be pretty wild, but it's not. It's very smooth. It's like almost it goes from this action sequence into this sort of like lyrical goodbye, lay in repose kind of funeral scene for Vakulnichuk.
So that scene there, I mean, I think that's based off of something that when they drop him off on the shore, it's not the text of the note that they actually use in real history, but that is what they did.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, part of it is without the context that any Russian audience would have had at this time. It's like, so why are the people coming down? Why is it such a big deal? Well, you're in the middle of a revolution. And so,
Right.
part of it is this is propaganda in the sense that it follows a particular line of how the revolution goes and so forth. But I think, part of it is what, what in terms of sort of presenting a revolutionary praxis, throughout this all the referring to each other as brothers among the sailors, and then the unity and the sympathy that things are sort of the way that note is supposed to, that's revolutionary agitation, right? Like
Right. Yeah.
it's supposed to anger the populace to see, look, one more way that this government has
Right.
mistreated us and so forth. And then, this person died literally for the most absurd of reasons. And I
Right.
think, so like, yeah, so you have your shot of like the crying mothers, and you have the shot of, the increasing anger. So as a
Well, and
model,
all the crowds too. Like these are huge crowd scenes that start to gather.
they're massive crowds. Like all of Odessa, all of revolutionary Odessa is coming down to see this. But as sort of a demonstration of sort of a what the revolutionary coalition is supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be
Mm-hmm.
the masses of commoners whose class composition is a little hard to figure out just by looking at their clothes, but it's regular people. It's not just some of them are working class, some of them might be sort of petty bourgeois. Um, and then and the sailors, and that this is the proper revolutionary coalition that should exist. I think, so
Well,
as
they literally give you a visual of building the coalition here in the scene, because in Act Three it's called "A Dead Man Calls Out." You get this. You get the townsfolk from Odessa, like you said, they slowly start to gather, and then at the end you get the sailors gather because they're going to make their final farewell and praise about Kunachuk as their
Mhm.
hero. But like they come in towards the end after we've seen this whole town, just like masses and masses of people, huge crowd scenes, start to gather around the harbor area where he was laid to rest.
Right. And this sets the stage for the sort of absolute unity between the city and the ship.
Right.
I mean, you see, so in the next one, the next act, which is called the Odessa Steps, you see, basically, it's the people that give the sailors good and healthy food, right? And they come out with all the boats
Right.
in the harbor, and you see them, they're right there. It's almost like they're taking ownership of the ship in the name of the people more broadly and creating a unity between them, but a
Mm-hmm.
temporary unity. So it's like these really they are powerful images of sort of revolutionary freedom where old hierarchies break down. There's a reason why I don't think we mentioned this movie has been banned in a lot of countries.
Yeah, a few.
What Britain, France, the United States, and under
Yeah.
Stalin for at least part of the time in the Soviet Union itself as well, because it is effective at showing it both how you rebel in a archetypal sense and how you show unity in an
Yeah.
archetypal sense, revolutionary moment in which people self-organize themselves to do what the state didn't do.
And not just for a moment. The clip that I found said that it was banned in the UK until 1954. That's that's pretty crazy. But the end of the sentence is France and other countries as well because of its revolutionary zeal. I read that as I read that as Einstein knocked it out of the park. He knows what he's doing. It worked. His montage theories of how to create this new meaning and to affect an audience were very worked very well.
So this is a ultimate in theory and practice in film.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
There's an interesting, I think this is a worthwhile point. There's an interesting piece by Ebert by Roger Ebert from his sort of review from 1998, I think, of Battleship Potemkin, where he's sort of talking about how it's all of its importance. He talks about all the stuff that you're talking about in terms of filmmaking, but that in a lot of ways it's lost its revolutionary power and its power to shock because it's so entered into everything that it's in everything. I feel that like you feel that some way about Citizen Kane until you watch Citizen Kane again and you're like, oh. But
Yeah.
he's sort of saying even when you watch this, you can't help but see it in a clinical way. But he talks about, I think he's
Mhm.
in Minnesota, and I think it's Minnesota. I got that wrong. And they're projecting it outside, and there's just regular people there, and
Mhm.
like they're playing like the band Concrete for the music. Like it's not, and it's like part of what it is it by taking it outside of the art theater context and putting it in a context with regular people who are gasping
Right.
at some of these scenes from a movie,
Yeah.
a silent movie, which normally these people, it shows its power. He basically says it brings back that revolutionary power that it has as a film
Yeah.
when you
Right.
when you take off the mothballs and treat it like what it is,
Right.
which I think leads us
Yeah.
to
Roadshow it.
yeah, well, which leads us to the most famous and significant scene in the movie, which is the Odessa Steps.
I mean, this is picked over like I don't know what the phrase is, 8 ways from Sunday or whatever, in film geek circles and YouTube clips. I think we both serendipitously found the same clip on YouTube of Roger Corman singing the praises of this section, which was like, yeah, he's right. But this one's actually an example of several of Eisenstein's montage ideas, but I think rhythmic is the most interesting one because it's also one of my favorite ones of his. If you watch the Odessa step sequence, Eisenstein switches from establishing shots to medium shots to close-ups in a very specific way, but he also does it in very specific shot lengths to build the action and to make it more and more frantic. The shots hold for a little bit longer at the beginning of the sequence versus towards the end of the sequence. He goes and you never feel, at least I did. I don't know. I don't think you did either, Isaac. You never feel disoriented in this sequence. I don't think.
Right? No, you don't. I don't think so. Which I mean, he could do that intentionally, considering what it's about. But no, I don't think you do at
But
all.
it's a multi-character, almost wordless. There's very few intertitles in this sequence at all. A multi-character ensemble piece where you're seeing individual little tragedies playing out on the steps as the government forces open fire and start marching down. But it never feels disjointed or like you never feel lost in what he's showing you. It's all there for a good reason, and you're led through it by a master, I think.
You don't really see the soldiers very well. Like they are just the marching column.
Yeah, I don't see a
Uh,
face at all. It's just a group.
and so, which is an interesting choice because, whereas the sailors are humanized in the rebellion, the soldiers are just a machine.
Mhm.
You do see the Cossack cavalry who are down below hacking at people with swords, but that's not exactly positive. But like the way he sort of frames this inexorable march, I think is a particular political statement about the government forces that won't break.
Right. Well, because they're attached to that monolith of the state force there.
Yeah.
So this one is rhythmic montage, which this is more I really like that. I like this one because it's more about the it's like the rhythm of the action in the shot. I guess in like hippie terms, it's more like the vibe. It moves more like music, I think, in this particular case. It's it's like compositional relationships in which you're looking at the movements within the frames. They're just as important as the length of the shot, because earlier he's playing around with different shot lengths to create intensity. Actually, we're going to get to an example of that towards the end of the film. But this creates this interesting complexity that you get out of building a rhythm, which it feels like it would have to be trial and error as you're putting this together, because you're having to you have to find the right rhythm. He's cutting a quick shot of eyeballs on the woman, who's then you see the child on the steps being stepped on, and the individual little narratives like we talked about that are playing out on the steps here that you're watching play out in longer shots at the beginning of the sequence, but then it gets tighter and tighter and quicker, and it builds tension within the viewer then that way. Because even as I was watching it for, I don't know, whatever, like the fourth, fifth time, getting ready for this podcast, like you feel, again, also because of the music, you feel like getting tense and tense and tense just as you're sitting there watching it, because like one, it's tragic, but also he's quickening the pace and the rhythm to ratchet up the tension as well.
Yeah. I just so from my less technical level, they step on children in this scene, and they pretty clearly kill a baby, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's part of it is that the level of violence that they're willing to go to, that he's willing to go to in this scene is maybe, maybe it's just the biases that come from watching so many movies, even pre-code, even a pre-code American movie would never do anything like this. Never even, not even close. All right, I'll take that.
No, not exactly. No, I was thinking of there's a pre-code movie called The Story of Temple Drake, where there's a woman in like this speakeasy, just dilapidated mansion where they're cooking booze, and they see a baby in the kitchen. Like, oh my god, you have a baby here? Why is it in this box? So the rats don't get it. Like, not a dead baby the way that you got it in Eisenstein here, but no. Well, one of the things that I think is interesting in this movie, which we don't even think about watching it in 2021, is you see blood in this movie
Yeah,
outside the body,
yeah.
and that's not a thing that is going on in Hollywood at the time. Not to the effect that Eisenstein's using here, but well, so after the end of the Odessa Steppe sequence is the sailors are here, and in retaliation, the sailors of Potemkin decide they're going to use the battleship and the guns to fire on the city opera house. Don't worry, they're not attacking art. This is where the Tsarist military leaders are convening a meeting. So like, oh, we can take on leadership. So they start, I guess, guns, cannons. I don't know the military terminology. They start blowing the hell out of the city opera house. This is really fascinating because this is a different type of montage sequence that I think is really interesting. This one is, they're all interesting. The guy's a genius, whatever. This is his intellectual montage, which is actually could be kind of a combination of a few of his other ideas so far. But this uses shots which, when you combined, elicit an intellectual meaning. It seeks to use very few images, but images that are really rich in culture, symbolic nature, like political history. And I think it's really good to use the example of the opera house because there's significance to the sculptures that are and they're outside the opera house and also being blown up. This is also when you get the cutting between the gun turrets and the statues of the opera house, specifically the lions. There's these lion statues that he shoots from different angles to almost look like the lions will go from sleeping to waking up. It almost looks like they're moving, and then it's explosions as the opera house is taken out. Which that's the hard end to Act 4. That's the hard end of the Odessa Steps, and then we get the final act, Act 5, which is one against all. This one, okay, I've read arguments that the Odessa Steps is the climax, and this is kind of the oh well, we still have another act to get through. I think the Odessa Steps is really powerful and is extraordinary, but I don't think it takes away from this final act where you have one of the most tension building scenes of the movie so far, in which the sailors of Potemkin decide to take the battleship out from the port of Odessa to face the fleet of the Tsar that's coming in. And it feels like battle is inevitable. So like you got the Potemkin, they're getting their guns ready. The Tsar squadron, like they're getting their guns ready. And this is an example of his metric montage where the editing follows a specific number of frames, and you shorten the number of frames every time you come back to this. So it tightens up. So you have like longer shot, cut, longer shot, cut, longer shot, cut. And then you start getting shorter shots and then shorter shots. And then you're showing all these different elements of people on Battleship Potemkin bracing for war, getting ready to, shoot off their guns. And you see the Tsarist army, they're getting ready. And then it gets quick. Their shots get quicker and quicker and quicker until you get to the final beat of this, which is the flag is flying. The red flag is flying, and then the Potemkin is allowed to pass between the ships. So I guess I kind of get the argument that it's anticlimactic because it's building up via that metric montage to be like, here it is, the battle. But like the release is that like, oh, hey, the Tsarist army is standing down as well, presumably joining the sailors on Potemkin in refusing to follow orders.
I mean, I think, well, what happens there is not a full mutiny. You don't have the entire fleet turning, but they refuse to fire, which allows them to escape. It's meaningful. Well, yeah, that's it. Is there meaning? Yeah, part of it is you've had a revolution get crushed in front of us, right? And they're the only bit of it left in Odessa. And now this overwhelming
Correct.
force is coming. But this is the revolution of 1905. There will be a revolution of 1917. And where does the hope for
Mm-hmm.
that come from? Where does the hope for that come from? that you know is going to happen. Well, it
Yeah.
comes from the potential of the sailors not going into full mutiny, but refusing to fire on the revolutionary brothers as
Right.
they escape, right? And that, like you pointed out, is that this is actually an incredibly tension-filled scene, but it's also necessary for the like the political message of the movie, and is necessary. I mean, I think as a film to have an arc in which things go in a particular direction, like in which there's something that happens for purposeful meaning. If you end with the crushing, you would still need scenes afterwards to be hopeless, right? And to show that all of this was for naught. But of course, that's not Eisenstein's point. Probably wouldn't have been able to make the movie if
Right.
that was his point. And so, he's trying to show that that is in fact not the case. And I think it's a beautiful scene showing how,
Yeah.
what it reminds me of?
Hmm.
Reminds me of Burn, Quemada, by
Okay.
Pontecorvo. Because at the end of Burn, the revolution has been crushed in blood and counterinsurgency warfare. But what's made clear
Mhm.
is that there is hope as our
Yeah.
main, the soldier, the young black soldiers can be agitated. They may not have come to their complete political awakening, but they are beginning to, and will be revolutions after this, and
They're on the path. Yeah.
the cycle will continue. And I feel like, with this,
Yeah.
any audience knows that the revolution is over after this point, and actually the ship is escaping, and historically they make it to Romania and then scuttle the ship, and then all go off their separate ways, which isn't quite as romantic. But
No, not quite.
this is a scene of revolutionary hope.
Yeah. And I think also, I think, like you said, narratively, it's a very satisfying arc from, I mean, just picture, like it starts with men and maggots, and then it ends with, one against all. And the way that it ends for the sailors that are still left alive on Potemkin heading out to sea. I know this was a piece it wasn't like Eisenstein was like, oh, I must tell this story. He was clearly very passionate about it, but it was like, it was almost like it was a commissioned film, like you said, for like the anniversary in 25 of the 1905 events. But also he had like this huge grand canvas of like multi-part film, et cetera, like going on and on. And then they chose just this Battleship Potemkin segment to actually film. I don't remember. God, it's been too long now. My brain isn't reaching back far enough right now. If it was ever planned to like, okay, we're going to go and film the rest of this at some point, they just never did. Because he's obviously Eisenstein went on to pretty amazing, stellar career. But I kind of wish he would have kept going, because if this was just like kind of this one nugget of this like grander full scale, like what would his film about like the eventual revolution have been like? That would have been pretty amazing.
I mean, well,
If this was like
doesn't
a 5-part series or something grand. Like I know it was a bigger canvas that he was supposed to be working with and filming in, and I think they even wrote, and then they just narrowed in on the Battleship Potemkin story when they went into production.
he has a movie with the storming of the Winter Palace, right?
I mean, there's not official. It's not like Battleship Potemkin 2, or like it's not.
Yeah, there isn't a
He didn't keep
saga.
going with the original. Yeah, the original saga, I guess that was pitched. So
I mean, he has. I mean, I think what it is there's this is almost part of a trilogy, but it's not the complete thing that he meant for it to be. And let me say, we're
that's what I
gonna
was trying to say.
yeah. So because no, he does Strike in 1925, and he does Battleship Potemkin in
Mhm.
1925. Then he does October in 1928, and that is I knew, I've never seen the movie, but I knew that he had done a
Oh, that's the 1917 one,
yeah, and
October. Yeah,
and it
yeah.
was internationally, they took the name 10 Days That Shook the World, because it's based off of John Breed's book of the same name about the revolution, which is what Reds is about. So he does that, and then the other movie of his that I've seen is Alexander Nevsky, which is like pure
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
is incredible, and is pure propaganda for the Germans are coming. I mean,
And is a source of our opening theme song.
it is the source of our opening theme song. That's Prokofiev, the great Russian
Yes,
composer
yes, yes.
Prokofiev. Um, But it's not an accident that you're making a movie about the Teutonic Knights invading medieval Rus
Right.
in the late 30s. It's like, oh, subtle, very subtle.
Right, right. But yeah, that is Potemkin. It's the pace of the movie, and again, I just credit to a film theorist who's exercising what he has theorized, what he's published, what he's like you said, he's putting his theory into practice. And almost 100, God, well, yeah, almost 100 years later, only a couple years off. The movie, it still moves at a clip. I ended up going through it twice before we recorded because it moves really quick, and I was like, well, that's a breezy watch. It's a roller coaster ride of emotions. There's the ups, the downs. It's a great ensemble piece. The action is amazingly choreographed. Again, for like 100-year-old movie, you're never lost in the action. You're very centered. Everything means something very specific. I think he's a wizard with his editing. Like the way he was able to just knock out of the gate with like what's that is I think it's his second feature. In a time when there's nothing really to go on. Like I said, there's some continuity editing that people have been doing worldwide, specifically Griffith, he was a fan of. Having to invent your own tools for your art form and being that good at it is so astounding. Like I want some stumbles. Like where are the stumbles that he had? Like where did he just burn the shorts? The burn the negatives from the shorts where he's like, oh, this doesn't work at all.
Right. Well, how much? Yeah, how much testing did you have to do? Of course, he's coming out with two movies in the same year. I mean, which isn't that uncommon. But it's yeah. Well, it's we've talked about this where there are people who just come out sort of fully formed. Obviously, he'd been. That's not necessarily the case here because obviously he'd done a lot of things before and he'd been in theater.
Yeah,
But like, it's theory can be bullshit, and I read a lot of theory. But sometimes your theory and your praxis actually meet, and you pull it off right off the bat.
yeah. Well, there's some I've heard some. I can't remember what's true, and what I've heard on like a podcast or a film history book, or I heard in class. But there was a thing when they were at the Moscow Film School, being so enamored by Intolerance, they got a hold of a print or two of Intolerance and would re-edit it themselves just to see like, what if we put this section here? What if we speed up this thing here? So there was some practice of the theory going. Even if they were going out and shooting their own film, there was some like playing around with existing film by a master filmmaker that they adored, just to see, would it work here? Why do they choose this? Oh, that's why I mean, imagine being that immersed in like one film that it frame by frame, but also you've rearranged it to see if this would work better or how that would work, and then you finally get a chance to do your own thing. You're ready to go.
I mean, it means you just get to play it being editor. I mean, that's what editors do.
Right.
But that is a really good exercise. I kind of want to do that now, because
Yeah, yeah. I hope film schools out there somewhere are doing that.
So this is we the truth is we haven't done that many classic movies. We haven't done that much from the 40s. I don't think we've haven't done anything from the 30s, and this is our first silent movie.
It's true.
Uh,
Well, we got some
so
pre-code coming up shortly.
we've got pre-code coming up, and that'll be fun. But I think it's sort of exciting. I think we need to do some jumping back.
Yeah. I think a good counter film, contemporary film, I don't know, a good one to look at, I think, from to expand our worldview of cinema from this time period would actually be German expressionism.
Okay, I'd be
Because
down for that.
that's almost like a turn away from montage to a certain degree. That's on mood, shadows, set construction, art design. Pretty fascinating stuff. But that is not what we have up next, though. We have a plan, and we're sticking to it. What is up next, Isaac?
Well, next episode we're going to be doing this month's nostalgia pick, and it is Aaron's turn.
Hell yeah, it is. Dead Presidents from the Hughes brothers. I have not gone back to this movie in quite a while, but I'm going to say I had I had a fairly serious obsession with the Hughes brothers, and it took me through their first several movies, and I'll get into that on the next show. But if this was a video podcast, you'd be able to see behind me. I have my framed laserdisc of Menace to Society hanging up in my cinema room here because it was my first laserdisc I bought. I found it used, and then I figured out who I knew that owned a laserdisc player after that because that was the VHS days, and I did not have access to the Hughes brothers director's commentary unless I had the laserdisc, and I found it used at a record shop for like $20 or something. So
Nice.
I need that commentary. I got to hear this. because I knew they were Scorsese fans, and that kind of fueled it. So we're going to do a dive into Dead Presidents from the Hughes brothers on our very next episode. But before we sign off, we'd like to remind you to be sure to rate and review the show in whatever podcast app you're using. And if you do enjoy the show, tell a friend or two or three, pass the word along. We're up and running on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, blah, blah, blah. The usual social media links are in the show notes. If you feel like giving us a follow, we're doing some other posting outside of just show content on those. So give them a look-see, give them a follow, give them a like if you feel so inclined. And until next time, I am Aaron Spears.
And I'm Isaac Miller. And, stay safe out there, especially if you decide to, I don't know, launch a revolution against an absolute monarchy while being underarmed, and then try to provide aid to a rebelling battleship, but get pinned down along the shore by advancing Cossacks and infantry. Just don't do it. It's not good. It doesn't end well. I'm not saying don't revolt. I'm just saying don't get pinned down along the shore. I'm just, that's all.
Just be safe.
Yeah.
Be safe and be smart about it.
Yeah, be smart about revolution, but do it.